guests of our today's meeting, Professor Bogumił Szmulik, Director of Instytut de Republika. Good evening, Professor. The Joseph Conrad Fellowship holders and all enthusiasts of Conrad works gathered in today's room and following the online broadcast of the event. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the lecture inaugurating the activity of Joseph Conrad Fellowship. It is a scholarship aimed at young humanists, the participants of which receive financial support, participate in a series of meetings, summer school, and work on their own project. The organizers of our today meeting and entire Joseph Conrad Fellowship program is Instytut de Republika. I would also like to express my gratitude for media support to our media patrons, Instytut Literatury i Kwartalnik Literacki Wyspa. During today's lecture entitled Joseph Conrad Today, we'll try not only to find the various contexts and sources that have shaped the author of Lord Jim, but also, above all, to ask the question of how and why we should read him today. Our special guest will help us in this task. I would like to warmly welcome Professor Robert Hampson. Good evening, Professor.
Good evening.
Good evening. British poet and academic and one of the most important experts in the life and work of Joseph Conrad. Professor Hampson is currently Professor Emeritus at Royal Holloway, Research Fellow at the Institute of English Studies at University of London, Visiting Professor at the University of Northumbria, and also the Chair of Joseph Conrad Society. Professor is the author of a very wide range of publications on Conrad and his contemporaries, including 3 critical monographs and the most recent critical biography, Joseph Conrad, published by Reaction Books in 2020. Professor, we welcome you very cordially. Before giving the floor to the professor, I would like to remind you that after the lecture, there will be the discussion part, in which I will ask our guest a few questions, during which there will be also time for questions from the audience. I would also like to inform you that there are headphones at your disposal through which you can follow the simultaneous translation of the lecture content. Dear Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking you all very much for inviting me to join you this evening for the launch of the Joseph Conrad Fellowship. I feel it's a great honor to be here. In the lecture that follows, I'm going to talk about Conrad and the global in 2 different ways. I want to talk about Conrad's global status and also Conrad's own engagement with globalization. For the first of these, I want to begin by raising the question of what the name Joseph Conrad signifies. Over the last couple of years, I've been involved in editing a substantial volume of essays on Conrad's reception across Europe, across almost all the European countries alphabetically, from Bulgaria and Czechoslovakia through to Slovenia and Ukraine. What's clear from this project is that Joseph Conrad means different things at different times in different places. At the simplest level, this is a matter of which works are translated and when they're translated. In the Soviet bloc during the Stalinist period, for example, The Secret Agent and Under Western Eyes were banned because they dealt with what was seen as anarchists. A variety of factors play into the decision to publish or not publish a particular text, and these factors include how the text seems to speak to contemporary concerns in the host culture, or how the text fits with or seems to fit with contemporary political imperatives. In Italy in the 1930s, for example, Mussolini's brother planned to bring out a complete edition of Conrad's works because of Conrad's perceived emphasis on duty and service. In the post-war period in Italy, by comparison, Conrad was promoted by young communists like Italo Calvino for his opposition to colonialism. There is then the additional question of how the selected works are actually translated. In Spain, for example, during the Franco period, translations of Conrad's Malay short stories were tweaked to make them less critical of white colonialists and to bring them more in line with Catholicism. Once the chosen works have been translated, the next issue is how they're marketed. Conrad has been presented in different countries and at different times as a writer of sea stories, as a writer of adventure stories, as a writer of boys' books, as an important modernist writer, and as a leading figure in world literature, and also, particularly after Chinua Achebe's essay and after Apocalypse Now, as the author of Heart of Darkness. There is then the question of which works are reviewed and how they are reviewed, and then how they are received by readers, by the general public. In Germany, during the Hitler period, for example, Conrad's works were read as a form of liberal humanist resistance to fascism. In Poland, during World War II, Lord Jim was an important text for members of the Home Army. In the USA, according to the FBI, The Secret Agent was read by the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski to justify a bombing campaign against advanced technology. This is perhaps a rather long-winded way of saying, as I said at the outset, that the meaning of the term Joseph Conrad is not stable, but shifts according to time, place, and culture. And I'm very conscious that what I say today is very much influenced by the fact that it's said from England at the present time. The reception of Conrad in England has also gone through successive changes. In his own lifetime, after the publication of his first novels, Almayer's Folly and An Outcast of the Islands, Conrad was initially seen as a writer of colonial fiction, like Kipling, and was praised for annexing Malaysia for English literature. After the publication of his short stories Typhoon and The End of the Tether, and the novella The Nigger of the Narcissus, he was seen as a writer of sea stories. Indeed, at one stage, he was so frustrated by this that he wrote of his desire to get freed from that infernal tale of ships, and that obsession with his sea life that, he complained, had only a limited bearing on his literary existence. Conrad's work was immediately well received in literary circles in England in the 1890s, but he had to wait until the publication of Chance in 1914 to receive popular success. Interest in his work slumped in the UK after his death in 1924. It began to revive in the 1940s with Muriel Bradbrook's Joseph Conrad, Poland's English Genius in 1941, and with F.R. Lewis's The Great Tradition in 1948. Bradbrook presented Conrad as a transnational writer who brought a migrant's critical cosmopolitanism to bear on contemporary politics. Lewis presented Conrad as one of the four great English novelists who changed the possibilities of the art of the novel and who are significant, he says, in terms of that human awareness that they promote. Bradbrook's Conrad was the Conrad of Prince Roman, The Rover, and Under Western Eyes. Lewis's influential volume established the Conrad canon for the next 30 years, in England anyway. It's a canon that begins with Heart of Darkness, Typhoon, and Lord Jim as minor works, and then presented Nostromo, The Secret Agent, Under Western Eyes, and Victory as major works. In Lewis's account, the cosmopolitan Pole, student of the French masters, becomes an English moralist concerned with what do men find to live for, what kinds of motive force or radical attitude can give life meaning, direction, coherence. However, Conrad is not presented by Lewis as a didactic writer, but rather as an artist whose artistry works through irony, through patterning, and through an interplay of contrasting moral perspectives. To address that other aspect of Conrad and the Global, the lecture that follows has four sections: Conrad and Modernization, the Napoleonic Wars, the Concord of Europe, and Conrad Today. So I'll begin then with Conrad and Modernization. Maya Yasinov begins her recent book, The Dawn Watch, Joseph Conrad in a Global World, by noting that Heart of Darkness has become a touchstone for thinking about Africa and Europe, civilization and savagery, imperialism, genocide, insanity, about human nature itself. To end the quotation. For herself as a historian, she observes, Conrad captured something about the way power operated across continents and across peoples, which is, she adds, something that seemed as important to engage with today as it had been when he started to write. In this context, she mentions Nostromo, which she describes as portraying multinational capitalism getting up to the same kind of tricks that I read about in the daily newspapers. She mentions Conrad's engagement with technological disruptions in the shipping industry, where victory would be a relevant text to consider. And she mentions also immigration, where the secret agent opens up all kinds of interesting issues. She concludes, Conrad's pen was like a magic wand, conjuring the spirits of the future. How did he do it? One of Yasenov's early suggestions is that from the deck of a ship, Conrad watched the emergence of the globally interrelated world that she was sailing across for her own research. Conrad's experiences in the merchant navy, that included India, Southeast Asia, Australia, the Caribbean, and even a glimpse of South America, were vitally important formative experiences for the future novelist. However, Yasenov's verb watched is too passive. Not only was he actively engaged in the sailing and navigation of various ships, but once he became a ship's officer, he was also involved in various aspects of trading. We might think of how the young captain in Conrad's story A Smile of Fortune has to manage the ship's trading in Mauritius and does an unexpectedly good deal on a cargo of potatoes. Or we might think of Conrad's son John and the account he gives of sailing his toy ships in the moat of Capel House, one of the houses the Conrads lived in. He describes how Conrad and his friend Hope, another famous sea captain, would join him and subject him to questions about his toy ships. He writes, they would want to know what the cargo was, where it came from, and where it was consigned to, and then they would ask for the ship's papers. Early in her book, Yasenov defines globalization in terms of an interdependent economy, open borders, ethnically diverse and networked populations, international institutions and standards, shared cultural reference points. And she points to the Suez Canal, the building of railroads, the telegraph system, and the integrated global finance this enabled as the 19th century contributors to the contemporary globalized world. From this perspective, she suggests, Conrad offers a history of globalization seen from the inside out. Conrad's view from the deck becomes an inside view of globalization, and more than that, an engagement with the ramifications of living in a global world, the moral and material impact of dislocation, the tension and opportunity of multi-ethnic societies, the disruption wrought by technological change. As Yasenov suggests, Nostromo is the obvious place to begin an exploration of Conrad's engagement with globalization. Conrad read widely in histories of South America in his background research for the creation of his fictional South American state of Costaguana. The novel begins with a reference to the conquistadors and that first encounter, or at least early encounter, between Europe and South America. And this is the passage. This is how the novel opens. In the time of Spanish rule, and for many years afterwards, the town of Sulaco, the luxuriant beauty of the orange gardens bear witness to its antiquity, had never been anything more important than a coasting port with a fairly large local trade in ox hides and indigo. The conquistadors remain as a latent point of reference for Conrad's account of the contemporary history of Costaguana. However, I would like to pause for a second over that opening sentence. It includes three apparently casual references to commodities, oranges, ox hides, and indigo. But each of them, like the reference to Spanish rule, subtends a long history. Oranges were introduced into Europe in the 10th century by the Moors in their occupation of the Iberian Peninsula, Al-Andalus. Spanish travelers introduced the fruit into South America in the mid-1500s. The trade in ox hides is a byproduct of the beef industry, and cattle farming was also introduced into South America in the colonial period. For example, cattle were first brought to Argentina by the conquistadors in 1563 and subsequently played an important part in the country's culture. Similarly with indigo, although indigo was used in Peru in prehistory, and an American species of indigo was cultivated in Guatemala by Spanish settlers, the modern cultivation of indigo is imbricated in the slave trade. The cultivation of indigo in the West Indies, for example, drew on the skills and knowledge of the African slaves who'd acquired these skills in textiles and dyeing in West Africa. Thus, Conrad's merchant navy background gives him this attention to trade and commodities, while his reading and intellectual curiosity provide the deeper historical context. The following sentence in Nostromo similarly draws on that naval experience, as it explains the combination of geophysical and climate conditions that had kept the clumsy deep-sea galleons of the conquerors out of Sulaco, and maintained Sulaco as a coasting port for local trade. Here, an important factor was the lack of strong winds in the Gulf of Placido, which made it difficult for sailing ships to navigate. The following chapters, however, show how Sulaco and Costaguana beyond that have not been protected from more recent conquerors. Chapter 2 introduces the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, a British-owned company whose steamships are impervious to the absence of strong winds in the Gulf of Placido. The company's offices are the only sign of commercial activity within the harbour, and the chapter suggests the company's financial and cultural dominance of the local region. This chapter also introduces another aspect of the modernization and colonization of Costaguana, the National Central Railway with its European engineers and its imported Italian and Basque workmen. Despite its name, there is nothing national about it. It's designed and built by Europeans. The railway board is based in London, and by implication, the capital for it comes from the same source. As Conrad would have known, there was a mania in Victorian England for investing in mines and railroads, where investing is really the polite term for speculating, or perhaps even better, gambling. In his novel Chance, for example, one of the central figures is the swindler de Barrel, who is described as having the gambling passion. De Barrel's father had started out lending money in a very, very small way to people connected with the docks, stevedores, minor barge owners, ship's chandlers, tally clerks, and so on. The son had a job in the West End branch of a great bank before setting up his own bank and trust, promising 10% returns on deposits. In some respects, then, de Barrel might perhaps be seen as a forerunner of modern hedge fund managers. When his businesses go bankrupt, it's discovered that he'd gone in for the most fantastic schemes, a harbour and docks on the coast of Patagonia, quarries in Labrador, such-like speculations. I've discussed Victorian railway mania, Victorian finance companies, and the banking situation more generally in more detail in my book Conrad's Secrets. For the present occasion, it's perhaps worth noting that in 1895, Conrad lost his inheritance by investing it in South African gold mines. So he had personal experience of contemporary speculation. To return to Nostromo, the novel is attentive to the infrastructure of shipping companies, railways, telegraphs, all of which are European owned. They represent modernization for this fictional South American country, but they're also presented as a neo-colonial domination of the place and its resources. This is evident in the account of the dealings of the chairman of the railways with the Costaguana government in relation to the acquisition of land for the railway. The chairman is reassured that he's dealing with, quote, cultured men to whom the conditions of civilized business were not unknown. Conrad's subsequent account carefully unpicks what the conditions of civilized business actually means. In Warren Valley, for example, the purchasing of the land for the railway was only a matter of price, and a commission had been nominated to fix the values. All that remained now was the judicious influencing of the commissioners. But in another area, the Creole landowners, all those aristocratic old Spanish families, were resistant or wanted what are described as outrageous prices for their land. In this case, the chairman consoles himself with the thought that the government was bound to carry out its part of its contract, even if it had to use force for that purpose. The final reassurance is the ultimate backstop, the thought that the president dictator has to support the railway, because after all, he was their own creature, since the railway company, has financed him. At the centre of the novel is Charles Gould and his silver mine, the Gould Concession. Gould makes his mine into the dominant power in Costaguana, but behind his mine is the figure of the American financier Holroyd, who backs it financially. Holroyd is, we're told, at the head of immense silver and iron interests, and he has an insatiable imagination of conquest. This imagination of conquest includes a view of America's future role in the world. Sorry. He says, we shall be giving the word for everything: industry, trade, law, journalism, art, politics, and religion, from Cape Horn clear over to Smith Sound, and beyond too, if anything worth taking hold of turns up at the North Pole. We shall run the world's business, whether the world likes it or not. If Conrad was drawing earlier on his knowledge and experience of physical geography, climate, and trade, he's here drawing on his interest in finance and contemporary politics. Conrad wrote Nostromo in response to recent events in Colombia. As Juan Gabriel Vázquez puts it in his essay, Remember the Future, in the novel, the province of Sulaco secedes from the Republic of Costaguana with the military aid, or is it the intervention, of the United States? In history, the province of Panama secedes from the Republic of Colombia with the the intervention of the United States. In January 1903, the Hay-Herran Treaty was signed, which granted the US a renewable lease in perpetuity from Colombia on the land proposed for a new canal across the Isthmus of Panama. This was ratified by the US Senate, but not by the Colombian Senate. At this point, Panama seceded from Colombia. US warships blocked sea lanes to protect the secessionists from Colombian forces. The US immediately recognized Panama as a new nation, and in November of 1903, Panama signed a deal with the US on terms similar to those in the Hay-Herran Treaty. In the same month, Conrad wrote to his friend Robert Cunningham Graham, "What do you think of the Yankee conquistadors in Panama? Pretty, isn't it?" At the end of Nostromo, what Conrad calls material interests have triumphed. The final chapters of Part 3 show the new world this has created. Chapter 10 begins by returning us to the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company. This is no longer just a harbour office and a wooden jetty. We're notified of the augmentation of the establishment with its crowds of clerks, an office in town, the old office in the harbour, and the increased scale of its operations is suggested by its division into departments, passenger, cargo, lighterage, and so on. The town of Sulaco as a whole has also massively expanded. In Chapter 10, Captain Mitchell from the Ocean Steam Navigation Company acts as our guide for a perambulatory tour of the new regenerated Sulaco. The tour begins with his account of the new gentlemen's clubs that have been established there: the Amarillo Club, the Anglo-American, with its mining engineers and businessmen, and the Mirliflores, English, French, Italians, all sorts, as he puts it. The Anglo-American Club, with its engineers and businessmen, speaks to the triumph of Holroyd's vision of an American century, while the Club for English, French, Italians speaks to the new cosmopolitan culture of Sulaco, but also to the penetration of the economy by European interests. The implication is that the indigenous people are further marginalized by this modernization of Sulaco. Captain Mitchell observes that there are lots of Italians settled here on the railway lands. There are whole villages of Italians on the Campo, before pointing to the American bar and observing, New Yorkers mostly frequent that one. The regenerated Sulaco has replaced the ox-cart track to the jetty with tramcars. The side of the plaza that was burnt down in the fighting has new buildings with French plate glass shop fronts. That is the latest technology for shop windows. The novel had already described this new Sulaco at the start of chapter 8 in part 1, with cable cars running along the streets of the Constitution and carriage roads far into the country where the foreign merchants and the ricos generally have their modern villas, with a vast railway goods yard by the harbour and the modern harbour with its quayside and a long range of warehouses. The narrator sums up all these changes as the material apparatus of perfected civilization. And he goes on, which obliterates the individuality of old towns under the stereotyped conveniences of modern life. Chapter 8 then supplies a particular example of these changes. When Charles Gould takes leave of Sir John, the chairman of the railway company, we are offered the following description of the plain outside the city. A multitude of booths made of green boughs, of rushes, of odd pieces of plank eked out with bits of canvas, had been erected all over it for the sale of canna, of dulces, of fruit, of cigars. Over little heaps of glowing charcoal, Indian women, squatting on mats, cooked food in black earthen pots, and boiled the water for the mate gourds, which they offered in soft, caressing voices to the country people. A racecourse had been staked out for the vaqueros, and away to the left, from where the crowd was massed thickly about a huge temporary erection, like a circus tent of wood with a conical grass roof, came the resonant twanging of harp strings, the sharp ping of guitars, with the grave drumming throb of an Indian gombo pulsating steadily through the shrill choruses of the dancers. I've quoted this at length, partly for the quality of the writing, but also because it reads like a piece of thick anthropological description. It's almost a shock to remember that this is an entirely fictional country, and that Conrad actually had very limited experience of South America, outside of his reading of books. As he says in his author's note to the novel, he was in the Gulf of Mexico in 1876, but his contacts with land were short, few, and fleeting. The San Antoine, in which he sailed to Martinique, did not visit ports in Colombia or Venezuela, and any visit he might have made would have had to have been done under his own steam, quite literally, by local mail steamers. I've also quoted it at length because in chapter 8, this vivid picture of indigenous life and indigenous folkways is followed by a brutal comment by Charles Gould. He says, "All this piece of land belongs now to the railway company. There will be no more popular feasts held here." The liveliness and the creative bricolage, as we see in that opening sentence, of the indigenous popular culture also stand in contrast to another image we're given in this chapter. After observing how the San Tome mine had thrown its subtle influence over the worn-out antiquity of Sulaco, we have the following passage. It had altered, too, the outward character of the crowds on feast days on the plaza, before the open portal of the cathedral, by the number of white ponchos with a green stripe affected as holiday wear by the San Tome miners. They had also adopted white hats with green cord and braid, articles of good quality, which could be obtained in the storehouse of the administration for very little money. The passage is even-handed. It observes that these are articles of good quality, which cost very little money. But again, it also notes the uniformity that is produced, and that uniformity of appearance is used to represent the subtle and pervasive influence of the mine. In the final chapters, in Captain Mitchell's account of the battle for Sulaco, he describes how the miners from San Tome, all Indians from the Sierra, joined the final stage of the fighting, rolling by like a torrent to the sound of pipes and cymbals, green flags flying, a wild mass of men in white ponchos and green hats, in order to save Charles Gould. We might note in this context that Captain Mitchell is described as carrying a white umbrella with a green lining on this guided tour of Sulaco, and that white and green, perhaps unsurprisingly, have become the colours for the new Republic of Sulaco. Another passage in chapter 8 touches on another aspect of the modernization of Sulaco that perhaps speaks to us more loudly in the current context of climate catastrophe. Conrad recounts how Gould and his wife, after a ride through a strip of forest, had reined in their horses near the stream and had gazed for the first time upon the jungle-grown solitude of the gorge that becomes the São Tomé mine. The head of a palm rose here and there. In a high ravine, the thread of a slender waterfall flashed bright and glassy through the dark green of the heavy fronds of tree ferns. This paradisal image is cancelled 2 paragraphs later when we're given the following. The waterfall existed no longer. The tree ferns that had luxuriated in its spray had dried around the dried-up pool, and the high ravine was only a big trench half filled up with the refuse of excavations and tailings. This is one of those cases, I think, where Conrad can be seen to be conjuring the spirits of the future, to use Yasonov's useful phrase. In this case, he anticipates current concerns about environmental catastrophe. Another instance of a passage which has gained additional meaning for present-day readers relates to the equestrian statue of Charles IV that appears near the start of chapter 6. This statue of Charles IV of Spain is described there as the only remaining vestige of a fact and name left by that royalty, whose very shadow had departed from the land. Indeed, as the narrator points out, the political changes in Costaguana have robbed the statue of its very name, and it's known locally simply as the Horse of Stone. In chapter 6, it's juxtaposed to another equestrian figure, indeed another Carlos, namely Charles Gould, who is nicknamed locally the King of Sulaco. In the final chapters of the novel, the statue reappears, or more precisely fails to appear. Captain Mitchell, on that guided tour of Sulaco, points to an empty pedestal. The equestrian statue that used to stand on the pedestal over there has been removed, he says. It was an anachronism. Instead of the statue of Charles IV, he says, there's some talk of replacing it by a marble shaft commemorative of separation. The equestrian statue is another part of the worn-out antiquity of Sulaco, the vestiges of that earlier Spanish colonization, which is being replaced by this new form of colonization that we might call modernization or globalization. The marble shaft commemorative of separation, that is, that celebrates the secession of Sulaco from Costaguana, would certainly fit in with other components of the public space of the regenerated Sulaco. Mitchell points out the bust of Don Jose Avellanos, patriot and statesman, in a dark niche inside the cathedral, and the marble medallion there that commemorates Martin Decoud. These memorials are designed to shape the narrative of what's called the New Era. Like the annual ritual of the Tres de Mayo coffee, which commemorates those who died in the fight against Gamacho's nationals, these contribute to the foundation story for the new nation. There is, of course, another allusion here that I don't need to point out to this audience. In that name, the Tres de Mayo coffee, Conrad, I think, has in mind the Constitution of the 3rd of May, 1791. Nostromo is full of references to the struggle for a united Italy and draws on accounts of the liberation struggles of various South American countries. But there is also another country and another history which is never very far from Conrad's thoughts. So at this point, I want to talk about the Napoleonic Wars. In Nostromo, Conrad provides the extended history of the mine from the early days when it was worked mostly by means of lashes on the backs of slaves, and whole tribes of Indians had perished in its exploitation, through to the present modernized version, where the miners from the São Tomé, all Indians from the Sierra, as we've seen, fight to defend Charles Gould and the aristocratic Blancos. But I want to leave Nostromo now and turn to another topic, and that topic is war. And I want to start with the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had a particular significance for an earlier generation of Poles, and the Napoleonic Wars occupied Conrad's mind for the last decade or more of his life. In A Personal Record, his volume of recollections, which was published in 1912, Conrad devotes a chapter to his grand-uncle, Nicholas B., that is, Nicholas Bobrovsky. He begins the chapter by announcing his unfavourable view of the character and achievements of Napoleon. He elaborates in the passage I've just put up on the screen. It was morally reprehensible for that great captain to induce a simple-minded Polish gentleman to eat dog by raising in his breast a false hope of national independence. It has been the fate of that credulous nation to starve for upwards of 100 years on a diet of false hopes. Conrad then gives an account of his granduncle's military career as an officer in Napoleon's Grand Army, and later in the short-lived Polish army. Conrad begins his narrative with a reference to the 1812 retreat from Moscow, but then focuses on his granduncle's part in the Battle of Leipzig in October 1813, the defeat of the Grand Army that was the prelude to the Battle of Paris and Napoleon's exile to Elba. The Battle of Leipzig was one of the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars, with heavy casualties on both sides. On the French side, about 38,000 men were killed or wounded, and about 15,000 men were captured. In Conrad's granduncle's account of his experiences, Leipzig was a shambles, using, I think, the original sense of that word, with some divisions of the French army, including Poniatowski's Polish Corps, jammed hopelessly in the streets, where they were being exterminated by the troops of the Allied powers. Conrad describes his uncle as someone whose first memories might have been shaped by the events of the last partition of Poland, and who lived long enough to suffer from the last armed rising in 1863, an event, he says, which affected the future of all my generation and has coloured my earliest impressions. His granduncle thus embodies a long period of Polish history, a period of false hopes and failed struggles for independence. A short story, The Duel, which Conrad wrote in 1907, was the first publication that came out of his Napoleonic researches. But the major outcomes of these researches were two novels, The Rover of 1923 and the posthumously published novel Suspense in 1925. The Rover is the story of the return home to France of a sailor who spent a lifetime away at sea. The action is set against the later stages of the French Revolution, the 1793 siege of Toulon and subsequent massacre at Toulon, Napoleon's transition from First Consul to Emperor, and the 1804 blockade of Toulon. The second novel, Suspense, takes place in Genoa in 1815 on the eve of Napoleon's departure from Elba and the start of the 100 Days, the War of the Seventh Coalition. I want to focus on two short works, Prince Roman of 1910 and The Warrior's Soul of 1917. Prince Roman was produced from material originally intended for a personal record. It's the story of Prince Roman Sangushko's involvement in the 1830-31 Polish-Russian War and his subsequent punishment of exile and service as a common soldier in the Russian army. Through Sangushko's story, Conrad sums up a Polish history of uprisings and defeats, as a result of which, as he puts it, our enemies have bestowed upon us the epithet of incorrigible. He then goes on to describe Polish nationality, in the Gothic idiom that he used for his essay Autocracy and War, as that nationality not so much alive as surviving, which persists in thinking, breathing, speaking, hoping, and suffering in its grave, railed in by millions of bayonets and triple-sealed with the seals of three great empires. Nicholas Bobrovsky and Prince Roman Sangushko might be seen as exemplary figures of Polish patriotism. The account of Prince Roman, however, offers a counterpiece to the account of Nicholas Bobrovsky. Where Nicholas Bobrovsky is, in the words that Conrad applied to his father Apollo Korzeniowski in his final days, where he is a vanquished man, Prince Roman remains unbowed. He survives the death of his beloved wife, 3 years' labour in the Siberian mines, service as a common soldier in the Russian army, and then when he returns to Poland after 25 years' exile, broken in health, he devotes himself to his fellow citizens. He's thus presented as an exemplary figure of civic virtue, always guided by a simple wisdom, a high sense of honor, and the most scrupulous conception of private and public probity, says Conrad. In these contrasting portraits of representatives of an older generation, whom he'd met very briefly as a child, Conrad presents the traditions of the Schlachter, the class into which he was born. He presented as a culture that placed value on military courage, on civic duty, on honor in public and private life, and, in these instances, commitment to an independent Poland. The Warrior's Soul is another story of the Grand Army's retreat from Moscow. As further evidence of Conrad's changing reception, early reviewers described it as the finest story in the book, The Tales of Hearsay, in which it was published. And indeed as one of the great short stories of the language, says one reviewer. But later criticism has been much less kind, and the stories in this final volume have been largely neglected in Anglo-American criticism of Conrad. Together with Prince Roman, The Warrior's Soul was commended for the rendering of the spirit of one people in the language of another in early reviews. However, this is not a story about Poles and Poland. The central figures in the story are both Russians. The narrator, an old cavalry officer, describes his part in the great rout of the Grand Army, and then introduces the story of his subaltern, the young Tomasov. Tomasov had been attached to the Russian mission in Paris, where he fell in love with a French lady whose salon he'd attended. He was saved from arrest at the outbreak of war between France and Russia by advance warning from an older French officer, de Castel. As Edward Garnett suggests in his review of the book, the contrast between Castel's first appearance as the brilliant, accomplished man of the world that Tomasov admires in Paris, and his later appearance as the grotesque horror of rags and dirt whom Tomasov takes prisoner during the retreat of the Grand Army, is the emotional heart of the story. De Castel begs Tomasov to shoot him and makes his appeal through various transnational bonds, as a fellow soldier, as a humane man, and through the shared code of honor. The Humane Tomasov was the working title for the story, and the Humane Tomasov, the character, accedes to these pleas and puts the Frenchman out of his misery. He's then criticized for the shooting of a prisoner in cold blood and retires to his home province, where a vague story of some dark deed clung to him for years. As the critic Arthur Waugh affirmed in his contemporary review of this story, the story implies that there is a nobler sentiment yet than love of country, and that is love for one's fellow men. The Warrior's Soul was written at the start of 1916. Conrad's friend Edward Garnett, in his review of the story, noted that Conrad had been brooding over war's fatalities at that time. But as I'll argue in a moment, that brooding had really started with the mass slaughter of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. In his brooding over modern warfare, Conrad could, in this story, extend his sympathies to this young Russian subaltern and his humane bond with a French officer during the Napoleonic campaign. Where Conrad's Russian narrator feels compassion when he contemplates the long, long trail of frozen corpses left by the retreating French army. They were Frenchmen. We didn't hate them. They didn't hate us. In this story, at least, Conrad could consider the humanity of des Russes sauvages, while never surrendering his active promotion at precisely this period of an independent Poland. I want to turn now to the Concord of Europe. I mentioned the Russo-Japanese War a moment ago. I want to say more about that now in relation to Conrad's essay, Autocracy and War. Conrad published this essay, his first political essay, in 1905. Zdzisław Najder describes this as Conrad's most extensive and ambitious political statement. Conrad first mentions the project that was to produce this essay in a letter to a French friend written in January 1905 on the eve of the Conrad's family departure for Capri for a holiday. He asks for a book on Russia, recent, serious, and then explains more fully I want something on the political and social aspect of the White Empire from the French point of view. He goes on, I have the idea of writing 3 articles on the future of the said empire, to keep the pot boiling, you understand. As it happens, the only thing he wrote during his time on Capri was this one essay, Autocracy and War. Although Conrad presents the essay as being undertaken for purely economic reasons, to keep the pot boiling, neither casts doubt on this expressed motive, since political articles paid less than fiction, and Pinker, Conrad's agent, was by no means sure of being able to place the essay in a publication. That then still leaves us with the question, why does Conrad want to write 3 articles on the future of the Russian Empire at this time? The Russo-Japanese War had arisen out of the expansionist policies of the 2 empires. Conrad glances at this in his essay when he refers to the economic and strategic origins of the war. He describes the war as arising from the fields of Korea for Russian wheat or Japanese rice, from the ownership of ice-free ports and the command of the waters of the East. For a decade, the Russians had pushed forward into northern China, the Liaodong Peninsula, and northern Korea, mesmerized by the prospect of acquiring a vast East Asian empire. They had, for example, used the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 as a pretext for sending 170,000 troops to Manchuria, supposedly to protect its railways. Japan was, of course, worried by this encroachment and had, since 1898, proposed a division of spheres, offering to recognize Russian dominance in Manchuria in exchange for Russian recognition of Korea as a Japanese sphere of influence. This culminated between August 1903 and January 1904 in a series of proposals and counterproposals between Japan and Russia. When the Tsar didn't respond to their final offer, Japan chose war to counter what it described as Russian aggression. On the night of the 8th-9th February 1904, the Japanese fleet under Admiral Togo launched a torpedo attack on the Russian Pacific Fleet at anchor off Port Arthur, a naval base in the Liaodong province in the south of Manchuria. It damaged 2 battleships and a cruiser. Around noon on the following day, in a second naval encounter, a Japanese squadron attacked and crippled a Russian cruiser and gunboat as they attempted to escape from Chamulpo harbor in Korea. By the end of February 1904, Korea was under Japanese domination. By May 26th, the Russian base of Port Arthur had been blockaded from the sea by the Japanese Navy and besieged from the land by the Japanese army. The Russian garrison in Port Arthur endured this siege until it surrendered in January 1905, after losses of 13,000 Russians and 110,000 Japanese. This war also involved a number of significant land battles, again with considerable loss of life on both sides. The Battle of Shaho, to which Conrad refers at the start of his essay, took place in October 1904. The battle was inconclusive, but involved heavy casualties. The largest land battle of the war took place in February 1905, again with very heavy casualties on both sides. To give some sense of what I mean by heavy casualties, in this battle there were over 60,000 Russian casualties out of 350,000 troops, and over 70,000 Japanese casualties out of 300,000 troops. Although the Russo-Japanese War is not often mentioned, this number of troops in the field was greater than those used in one battle in any war of the 19th century. This was the last major land battle of a war whose nature Conrad accurately describes in the opening paragraphs of his essay. Instead of the famous 3-day battles of history, he writes, the land battles of the Russo-Japanese War can be characterized as lasting for weeks, flaming up fiercely and dying away from sheer exhaustion, to flame up again in desperate persistence and end not from the victor obtaining a crushing advantage, but through the mortal weariness of the combatants. Although Conrad could not have known this when he wrote the essay, this was obviously also a foretaste of what was to come in the World War of 1914-18. After this land battle, there remained one final sea battle, which was the largest naval battle since Trafalgar. The Russian Baltic Fleet had been sent from northern Europe in October 1904 to break the Japanese blockade of Port Arthur. After various mishaps, the fleet arrived in the Straits of Tsushima in May 1905, where over a period of 2 days it was entirely destroyed by the Japanese fleet. As a result of this battle, Russian naval power was itself destroyed, and Japan has established itself as a major naval player. As Conrad's essay makes clear, he was writing at a time when the actual outcome of the war was still to be determined. He mentions all that talk as to what Russia will or will not do, whether it will raise or not another army. In the aftermath of the war, most of 1905 was given over to various diplomatic maneuvers, including not just Russia and Japan, but also Britain and America. This was not so much a matter of nations and nation formation, which I touched on in relation to Nostromo, but rather negotiations between old and new imperialist powers. At the same time, this unsuccessful war in Manchuria had repercussions back home for the Tsar. Massive strikes, political protests, and uprisings swept across the Russian Empire, exposing the inner fragility of the Tsarist autocracy. On the 22nd of January 1905, for example, a huge procession of workers and their families had made their way to the Winter Palace to hand in a petition to the Tsar demanding political and economic reforms. They were met by armed troops, and by the end of the day, hundreds were left dead and wounded. Early in the essay, Conrad refers to the buried millions of Russian people, and he then recalls how, through the mists of print, we've seen their blood freezing crimson upon the snow of the squares and streets of St. Petersburg, presumably referring to this demonstration. Although he was critical of newspaper reports, in this essay Conrad was clearly aiming to make his own contribution to the discourses circulating around these events. More importantly, this essay marks a radical break in Conrad's writing career, as he makes his first move towards the European model of the writer as a public intellectual. In this light, I want to turn now to consider Conrad's essay in more detail. Conrad begins the essay with an evocation of the suffering of the combatants in the Russo-Japanese War. He addresses the necessarily mediated nature of our knowledge of this suffering through the veil of inadequate words, and the problem of engaging imaginative sympathy for human suffering on this scale. He argues that the statistics of war reporting, which I've been using, won't actually do this. The stream of reports, appalling in their monotony, of tens of thousands of decaying bodies tainting the air of the Manchurian plains, of other tens of thousands of maimed bodies groaning in ditches, crawling on the frozen ground, filling the field hospitals, he suggests isn't adequate. In passages like this, however, while lamenting the limitation of words and statistics, Conrad is also clearly working with the same tools to try and awaken our imaginative sympathy. Conrad then introduced a longer historical perspective and takes his readers back to the French Revolution. In a letter to his agent from Capri, Conrad writes that he's been working on a political article, The Concord of Europe. He writes, "It's a sort of historical survey of international politics from 1815, the Vienna Congress, with remarks and conclusions tending to demonstrate the present precarious state of that concord and bringing the guilt of that precariousness to the door of Germany, or rather, of Prussia." The Congress of Vienna was designed to reorganize Europe after the French Revolution and after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. In the redrawing of European boundaries that resulted from this treaty, Austria, Russia, and Prussia made major gains. It's this history and the order produced by the Congress of Vienna that lies behind Conrad's judgment on the Napoleonic episode as a school of violence, as a sower of national hatreds, as the direct provoker of obscurantism and reaction, of political tyranny and injustice, to quote Conrad. However, in that same letter, Conrad also observes that what he's written of this political article now needs recasting in view of the recent events in Russia. As a result, the initial focus in the published essay is firmly on Russia. Although the war with Japan is not technically over, Conrad draws a clear lesson from it, that the ghost of Russia's might is laid, that the myth of its irresistible strength has been shown to be an illusion. For 100 years, he writes, the ghost of Russian might has overshadowed the councils of Central and Western Europe. But this war with Japan has exposed precisely the inferiority of minds, of military and administrative systems. Conrad is also conscious that this lesson has perhaps been missed in Europe as a result of racist attitudes, or as he puts it, the greatness of the lesson has been dwarfed for most of us by an often half-conscious prejudice of race difference. As Conrad accurately perceives, this lesson has implications not only for international politics, but also for domestic politics in Russia. The torpedoes of Togo and the guns of Oyama, he says, have cracked the gravestone of autocracy. and the first stirrings of a resurrection are making themselves felt. He writes, "The war in Manchuria makes an end of absolutism in Russia." Conrad approaches the implications for Russia through a brief theorizing about the state and the 19th century development of nations. He begins with an organic model of the state. It's a matter of logical growth, of faith and courage, springing from the constructive instinct of the people, governed by the strong hand of a collective conscience. He then decodes this by explaining the history of European nations in terms of a struggle between the old monarchical principle and the growth of political liberty. As a result of this struggle, Conrad claims, the idea of nationality as we see it, concreted at the present time, has evolved. But he is also clear that this evolution is still in process, and he writes the following. This service of unification, creating close-knit communities, possessing the ability, the will, and the power to pursue a common ideal, has prepared the ground for the advent of a still larger understanding, for the solidarity of Europeanism, which must be the next step towards the advent of concord and justice. As against the errors of national selfishness, which were manifest in the Congress of Vienna and were to lead to World War I, Conrad presents the solidarity of Europeanism as the only possible goal of our progress, against alliances between nations shamelessly based upon the exigencies of suspicion and mistrust, again manifested in the Congress of Vienna. He imagines a future when there will be no frontiers in Europe. In the final part of the essay, Conrad turns his attention to contemporary Germany. It's a powerful and voracious organization, he writes, full of unscrupulous self-confidence, whose appetite for aggrandizement will only be limited by the power of helping itself to the severed members of its friends and neighbors. This latter part of the essay is less concerned with the Russo-Japanese War than with contemporary militarism and the anticipation of a coming war. Thus he observes that never before has war received so much homage. It has harnessed science to its gun carriages. It has perverted the intelligences of men, women, and children. It has sent out apostles of its own, who at one time went about, mostly in newspapers, preaching the gospel of the mystic sanctity of its sacrifices and the regenerating power of spilt blood. Now the repeated phrase, "Europe is no more," has acquired a new meaning. He writes, "There is only an armed and trading continent, the home of slowly maturing economic contests for life and death." There are thus two different views of Europe present in the essay. The first optimistic view is expressed in terms of the solidarity of Europeanism, which Conrad says must be the next step towards the advent of concord and justice. This view of a federal Europe was perhaps particularly congenial to Conrad. As he observes in The Crime of Partition, the Polish state offers a singular instance of an extremely liberal administrative federalism. Towards the end of the essay, however, as we've just seen, a very different picture of Europe emerges, that of an armed and trading continent, the home of slowly maturing economic contests for life and death. The dream of a pan-European frontierless community is set against the apprehension of a coming war based on the contemporary reality of material interests and national alliances based on mutual distrust. In this context of competing nations and competing nationalisms, Germany becomes paradigmatic. Germany's attitude proves that no peace for the earth can be found in the expansion of material interests, says Conrad. Against this promotion of a pan-European identity and the critique of contending nationalisms, however, there is the particular lens through which Russia and Germany are seen throughout the essay. The dream of a frontierless Europe is combined with a very particular concern with boundaries, with the redrawing of boundaries, and with the boundary as a scar, which comes out of an unexpressed identification with Poland. If the Polish state provides Conrad with a model of federalism in The Crime of Partition, this essay, Autocracy and War, is haunted by the erasure of Poland's national boundaries. Within the essay, Conrad is negotiating between a desired pan-European identity and an implicit identification with Poland as a nation. At the same time, by writing a political essay in English, Conrad is also presumably aiming to have some impact on contemporary English political discourse in what has to be seen as a form of transnational political activism. In the final section, then, I want to consider Joseph Conrad today. And I think of these questions. I want to begin this final section by going back to Mayor Yasanov's suggestion that from the deck of a ship, Conrad watched the emergence of the globally interrelated world that she was sailing across. I suggested that Conrad's experiences in the merchant navy were vitally important formative experiences for the future novelist. I proposed that this was not just a matter of Conrad's travels and the various places he went to, it was also because his years in the merchant navy meant that he was involved in global trading networks, whether it was his experience of local trading around Borneo and Celebes, or the long hauls between England and Australia. I might also have mentioned his experience of the international community of ship's crews, as evidenced, for example, in his narrative about the voyage of the Narcissus, with its crew of 2 Norwegians, a Finn, a West Indian, and presumably a Polish officer, among the various kinds of British person present. I might also have mentioned the trained observation that was part of his naval training and professional practice. We still have the notes he made in his upriver book, the journal he kept while going up the Congo River, as a demonstration of this professional practice. But in addition to this multifaceted experience of maritime life, we also have to remember, I think, Conrad's deep interest in and deep knowledge of European history, as I've suggested in relation to relation to Nostromo and Conrad's Napoleonic fictions. As I've implied, this interest was always imbued with a commitment to the cause of Polish independence for which his parents had died. In this final section, concluding section of the lecture, I want to address those 3 questions. Why read Conrad today? What has been his impact on later literary phenomena? And what is his current critical status? But in fact, what I'm going to do is just address the first of those and leave the others open for the discussion later. Inevitably, the first question, why read Conrad, raises a prior question, who is the reader? For me, as someone who spent a lifetime reading novels, and for whom novel reading has been my business, the first answer to the question, why read Conrad, has to be the sheer quality of Conrad's writing. And by that I mean his ability to craft sentences, paragraphs, and chapters. From his reading of Flaubert and Maupassant, he derived the aesthetic idea of le mot juste, that is, finding exactly the right word for what he wanted to present to the reader. Every word in his texts has been carefully pondered and has a purpose. We saw something of this in my attention to the opening sentences of Nostromo. Another part of this aesthetic for the novel was the importance of cadence. Conrad's labour over his texts was in part directed by his attention to the rhythm of his sentences. Conrad's prose should really be read out loud to appreciate this. It is to me very striking how many poets have been drawn to Conrad, either as critics, translators, or in their practice as poets. Conrad critics like André Boucher or Gary Geddes, for example, to take just 2 examples from Canada, both have another existence as published poets. That is, then, for some readers, there is a pleasure to be derived from reading Conrad purely at the level of his handling of language. Related to this is his technical skills as a novelist. From the start of his writing career, we see a powerful creative intelligence exploring the form of the novel and the form of the short story. We observe this, for example, in his handling, adaptation, and transformation of various genres of the novel, the adventure story, the sea story, the detective story. He was taken up by André Gide, as I've said, and other French novelists and critics, for the model he provided of an action-based fiction that had psychological, political, and philosophical depths. We can see this creative intelligence also at work in his exploration of different methods of narration, from his early occasional uses of omniscient narration, through his use of various narrators, to his subtle use of what's called free and direct speech. That is, where the narrative is presented through the perspective of one or more characters. Conrad's exploration of the form of the novel has meant that his work has been taken up by other novelists. I've already mentioned Gide, who translated Conrad's story Typhoon, who took charge of the first edition of Conrad in French, and was inspired by Heart of Darkness to go to Africa and to produce his own African works. In Germany, Thomas Mann promoted Conrad's work in the 1920s and 1930s. And more recently, a work like Christa Wolf's Störfall, Accident, draws on Heart of Darkness. In Italy, Cesare Pavese and Italo Calvino promoted Conrad's works through translations and critical articles, while in Poland, among others, Jacek Duchaj has written on drawn on Heart of Darkness in his novel Ice. This range, and other authors I could mention, suggests something of Conrad's vital presence in world literature. And then, in conclusion, we come to the subjects that Conrad deals with and his ways of dealing with them. From what I said a moment ago, we can see that one element in Conrad's fiction is psychological exploration. In my first book, Joseph Conrad, Betrayal and Identity, I explored Conrad's fiction in terms of acts of betrayal as ways of exploring different models of identity. Part of the point of using the psychologists I used was that their version of psychoanalysis always takes place within a critical understanding of the social context, and the same holds true of Conrad's fiction. If Heart of Darkness involves a descent into the self on the part of Marlowe, that descent into the self is contextualized as that of a 19th century English sea captain who's experienced the horrors of Leopold's exploitation of the Congo and its peoples, who has seen for himself the gap between the rhetoric of the civilizing mission promoted by politicians and circulated by newspapers, the gap between that and the reality on the ground. And this returns us to something I drew attention to early on, namely Conrad's interest in history and politics. His early work set in the Malay archipelago, among other things, provide a unique record of the trade, politics and culture of the region that have been used by historians of 19th century Southeast Asia. In these novels and short stories, Conrad provides a thick description of some of the different cultures of the archipelago, Bugis, Sulu and Chinese, and their interaction with English and Dutch colonizers. My second book on Conrad, Cross-Cultural Encounters in Conrad's Malay Fiction, explored this area and situated Conrad's works within an English tradition of writing about Malaysia. With his middle period works like The Secret Agent and Under Western Eyes, Conrad situates his narratives within the cities of London, St. Petersburg and Geneva. The Secret Agent revolves around the historical event of the apparent attempted bombing of the Greenwich Observatory in 1894, but uses this incident to explore the policing of London and issues around immigration. Under Western Eyes similarly takes off from an historical event, the 1904 assassination of Depleva, the Russian Minister of the Interior and the Tsar's right-hand man. In both these cases, then, Conrad was responding to relatively recent events in his fiction. What Conrad offers the reader, then, is a fiction that is informed by his historical and political interests, that engages in subtle and profound psychological explorations, and is driven by an ethical concern that is not didactic, but is comfortable with uncertainties. Indeed, there's a very deep skepticism throughout his work that constantly challenges the reader, and that kind of unsettling, I think, is important to living in a constantly changing world. I'll end there. Thank you.
Joseph Conrad znaczył różne rzeczy w różnych miejscach i czasach. Moje pytanie brzmi następująco. Co Joseph Conrad znaczy, jaka jest jego pozycja we współczesnej historii literatury w Wielkiej Brytanii i jaki jest, to też jest istotne, jaki jest wkład pana najnowszej biografii w dyskusję o miejscu Josepha Conrada, czym ono na przykład różni się od tych, które znajdujemy w książkach chociażby wspomnianego Najdera czy Jasanow.
I'll take that as two separate questions. So the first question is to do with the Conrad in Britain at the present moment. And I think one of the interesting things, there are two interesting things happening, I think. One is an interest in Conrad in the context of transnationalism. And so there's quite a lot of work being done on Conrad as a transnational writer in relation to operating across different nations. Related to that is there's also quite a lot of interaction. One of the interesting recent developments has been engagement with Polish criticism of Conrad. And there are much more kind of productive dialogues taking place, so that Conrad's Polishness is also important. And that is being emphasized. So I started off with mentioning Lewis, and Lewis presents Conrad as part of the great tradition of the English novel. And what's elided from that is the Polishness. Whereas what's being put back now, I think, is precisely that, the Polish aspects of Conrad. And I think that relates also then to the second question about the biography I wrote, that I start off with Virginia Woolf's comment on Conrad in her obituary for him, where she says, our guest has left us. And I picked up that word guest because Conrad had been naturalized for 20 odd years, so that for her he was still a foreigner. And so I was wanting that my way into the biography then was partly to, on the one hand, was to go with that and to focus on Conrad's Polishness. So one of the things that there's more of in this biography than in other ones is Conrad's engagement with Rettinger and the political issues around Polish independence that Rettinger was engaged with. So I think that chapter on Rettinger in particular is doing something which isn't present in some of the earlier biographies, partly because it's drawing on new material on Rettinger. But what I was interested in was in Conrad as an immigrant, and what that means then in the present context, which is to have access to two cultures and to be working across two cultures, two nations, to be working across complicated loyalties.
W swoim wykładzie wspominał Pan również Maję Jasanow, która w biografii Konrada opisuje historię rozpoczynającej się globalizacji właśnie przez pryzmat książek Konrada. Czy myśli Pan, że właśnie ten fakt, jego wielonarodowość, czy momentami wręcz pewna forma globalnego nomadyzmu, nieprzynależność do jednego konkretnego miejsca, jednej konkretnej narodowości w tym samym czasie, była czymś unikalnym dla literatury w tamtego czasu? Czy perspektywa Konrada jako, można powiedzieć, globalnego nomady była czymś, co nie zdarzyło się w tamtym czasie w literaturze, jako perspektywa przykładowo na kolonializm, na rozwój nowoczesności?
Yeah. No, I don't think it was, because one of the other figures I mentioned was Kipling, and it's a very different instance, but in Kipling is someone who is born in India, brought up in India, comes to England, and then spends a lot of his life moving around the world. So I think that nomadism is something which is quite common, relatively common in that period, and some of it is to do with people who are born in a colony and then come back to England. And some of it is to do with people who go out. I'm thinking also, say, for example, of Conrad's friend, Robert Cunningham Graham, who has very strong connections with South America, or at the same time as being descended from the royal family of Scotland and actually having a better claim to the British throne than the Windsors, was one of the jokes that he made. Or Conrad's other friend, W.H. Hudson, again was born in South America and came to live in London. Part of what's going on in Conrad's circle is a cosmopolitanism around London. So that, for example, there's his friend, Sir Hugh Clifford. Hugh Clifford is descended from English gentry. At the age of 17, he's sent out to Malaysia as part of the colonial service, spends most of his life either in Malaysia or in Nigeria or in various other parts of the world as part of the colonial administration. So there's quite a number of people who have that kind of nomadic existence. And it's a group of people that Conrad has contacts with. Another way of looking at that is looking at someone who's not nomadic, his friend Edward Garnett, who is very firmly based in England. But Garnett's wife learns Russian and is the major translator of Russian literature into English. She translates Dostoevsky and others into English, and also has very active engagement with Russian emigre groups, particularly Russian political refugees living in London. So there's London, it's partly, for me, what's important is that cosmopolitanism of London in this period, and the different groupings that Conrad is meeting as a result of that, or has connections to as a result of that.
Rzecz, która teraz mi przyszła do głowy, tak, bo oczywiście z jednej strony faktycznie możemy mówić o wielu innych przykładach, też z Imperium Brytyjskiego, pisarzy, również znajomych Konrada, którzy poruszali się w tym wielonarodowym, można powiedzieć, płynnym środowisku wymiany dóbr, wymiany idei, wymiany kapitału, wymiany ludzi, ale jednocześnie perspektywa Konrada, czyli kogoś, kto pochodzi z kraju, który stracił własną narodowość, a jednocześnie obserwuje prężące muskły państwo brytyjskie, które się rozwija, czy jego perspektywa na właśnie to, w jaki sposób kształtowała się brytyjska nowoczesność, ale też jakiś szerszy model nowoczesności globalizującej się, czy właśnie ten brak państwowości i jego polski skomplikowany los sprawiało, że pewną unikalną jakość jednak wnosił. To nie jest może moja teza, ale zastanawia mnie to po prostu w tym momencie.
A theory?
Right. what's interesting for me is the way in which, to begin with, he is aligned with Kipling, and he's seen as being a writer, as a kind of pro-colonial writer. And I mentioned that term annexation, that he's seen as annexing Malaysia, as being someone who writes about Malaysia in the way that Kipling writes about India. There's a basic misunderstanding of what Conrad is doing there, and that Conrad's writing is not celebrating empire, but is actually critical of colonialism. So there was a part of what goes on there is various kinds of misreading as well, at least as I see it. I think there's also, what I'm conscious of is more the way in which that nomadic and multicultural aspect of Conrad opens him up then to other writers across the world, rather than specifically in England. I'm thinking of people who picked up on his work in England. So I'm thinking, for example, of there's a writer, David Daberdeen, who wrote a novel called The Intended, and The Intended is using that title from is referring to Heart of Darkness, and this is very much about Daberdeen growing up as someone from the West Indies in England and encountering Conrad, and encountering Conrad's work on Africa and having to negotiate, particularly issues around representation of race in Conrad. Or a more recent example would be, there's a film by a man called Rob Lemkin, which is to do with it's set in Niger, and is to do with a member of a Frenchman who goes into Niger in the 1890s and engages in a campaign of slaughtering his way through Niger. And what Lemkin does is he follows in the footsteps of the man whose name I'm just blanking on, this French officer, and he takes with him a young contemporary Black Briton. And the film then is quite complicated because it's to do with the experience that young man has following in this Frenchman's footsteps while being influenced by Heart of Darkness. So Heart of Darkness is used all the way through as a point of reference. But the change that's been made is it's a Black Briton who goes into Niger, who has to encounter the fact that in Niger, he's not regarded as black, but is regarded as being British. So again, it's ways in which Conrad opens up various kinds of questions about the complexities of belonging, about identity, in this world. I think I've missed some of your question, though. There's some other parts of your question I've not responded to.
Możliwe, że tak było, ale już teraz nie chciałbym poświęcać czasu do bardzo szczegółowe skupianie się na tym, o co zapytałem poprzednio, ponieważ wątek, który teraz już się wyłonił, czyli stosunek czy sposób przedstawiania kwestii rasy, kolonizacji Afryki w twórczości Conrada, też wydaje mi się czymś, co staje się w jakiś sposób kontrowersyjne. Polska recepcja, oczywiście taka można powiedzieć bardzo szkolna, bardzo ogólna, chociażby właśnie wspomnianego jądra ciemności, jest jako manifestu antykolonialnego, manifestu tego, w jaki sposób rasizm stanowi, można powiedzieć, element DNA brytyjskiego imperium, ale z drugiej strony pojawił się taki głos, jak chociażby znanego bardzo afrykańskiego pisarza Chinua Achebe, który pisał o Josephie Conradzie jako bloody imperialist, jako cholernym imperialiście, mówiąc brzydko. Czy wydaje się panu, że ta perspektywa może w jakimś stopniu stać się dominującą narracją o Conradzie i w jakim stopniu jest ona usprawiedliwiona?
Right. Okay. There are a number of issues there. I think one issue is the way in which Conrad then is in this argument is reduced to being just the author of Heart of Darkness, and the rest of the work is ignored. And there was a conference in Africa in about 1900, South Africa, where there were part of the group there were post-colonialists who were arguing that Conrad was a racist and shouldn't be studied, and based on the Achebe article. And the only Conrad they'd read was Heart of Darkness. So when against them was brought up Conrad's other African story, An Outpost of Progress, which does all the things that Achebe says Conrad doesn't do, it has 4 or 5 different African cultures, all of which are distinguished. But none of them had read this, and Achebe never mentions this other story. He focuses on Heart of Darkness, and he insists that Conrad is Marlowe, whereas Marlowe is an English sea captain. He's a character in the novel. The other thing I think that's important is that what Achebe is responding to in that 1975 lecture is how Conrad was taught in America in the 1960s and 70s. And he's responding to a very particular edition of Conrad, which was edited by Albert Gerhard. Albert Gerhard put together Heart of Darkness and The Secret Sharer. And he argues that Conrad, in that edition, he argues that Conrad is purely engaged in psychological exploration, in depths, in explorations into the self. And he says there in his introduction that the setting in Africa is totally irrelevant. And it's that edition, which was very popular in America, it was very cheap. It's the New American Library edition, which you could buy for $1. And it was widely used by students because it was the cheapest available. It's the dominance of that reading of Conrad by Albert Gerhard in the American Academy, which Achebe is responding to. In the British Academy, which I was in this period, Conrad Heart of Darkness was taught as an anti-colonial text. It was taught as a political text, but it wasn't taught that way in America because of the American Cold War, where the political side of Conrad was removed to emphasize the psychological side. So part of the issue is that, ironically, the dominance of Achebe's view, or the predominance of Achebe's view, is to do with the dominance of American culture over other cultures, because it's addressing what was then a specifically American way of reading Conrad, which wasn't the way Conrad was being read elsewhere in the world. There is an issue around the way in which Africans are represented in that novel, which makes it difficult for Black British people to read. But it's Marlowe's representation rather than Conrad's. The narrative that what Conrad does is set up Marlowe's narrative through an unnamed narrator, so that Marlowe's narrative is actually framed, and all the discourse around civilized and savage, blackness and whiteness and so on, is actually staged for us to engage with as an issue, rather than being something which is being promoted as such. So I think that there are problems with Achebe's argument. I think Achebe pointed to something very important, which was the whole question of race and in relation to Conrad. But I think his own particular text, while it was a necessary intervention, nevertheless is not the final answer.
Chciałbym wrócić, jeszcze to już będzie moje ostatnie pytanie, po którym chciałbym oddać głos publiczności, wrócić do wątku czy aspektu polskiego w recepcji, jak również samoświadomości Konrada, ponieważ w Polsce mamy też pewien utrwalony motyw etycznego klucza, w którym odczytujemy Konrada. Mówimy o konradowskiej etyce poczucia odpowiedzialności, heroizmu, o konradowskim bohaterze, czyli tym, który ciągle jest na posterunku, ciągle jest gotowy, jest człowiekiem akcji. I to stało się w pewnym momencie również pewnym silnym elementem etosu. Lord Jim to ostatnia książka, która zostaje znaleziona przy Józefie Piłsudskim. Jest czytany również przez członków polskiego ruchu oporu w czasie II wojny światowej. Myślimy o nim po części jako ambasadorze polskiej kultury, ale czy sam Joseph Conrad chciał być takim ambasadorem i czy ta, można powiedzieć, recepcja, która została do niego w jakimś sensie przypięta, polskiego twórcy etosu niezależnej jednostki, można powiedzieć polskiego egzystencjalizmu, to jest coś, z czym Conrad by się sam utożsamił?
Actually find this suitable.
I think he'd be delighted by that. I think he'd be really happy that he was being read as as ambassador for Polish culture. I think he'd be very pleased with that. I think certainly from what he was doing, from writing with a personal record, what he was very deliberately doing there was bringing Polish culture into English literature. There was a deliberate move he makes at that time, around 1907, 1908, 1909. There's a move to bring his Polishness into his literature, and there's also subsequently, there's then a move to engage politically with Polish independence, and this comes through partly through that relationship with Rettinger, and that is behind the visit he makes to Poland in 1914. So he writes essays like The Partition of Poland, as well as Poland Revisited, as well as Autocracy and War.
Szanowni Państwo, przekazuję już mikrofon Jakubowi i proszę o pytanie, jeśli takie są.
Jeszcze tylko pozwolę sobie zaprosić Państwa do zadawania pytań w sposób śmiały. Jeśli są jakieś rzeczy, które też dla Państwa projektów byłyby jakby interesujące tutaj, to jest ten moment. Ja chciałbym zapytać Pana Profesora o jedną rzecz, która mnie osobiście zainteresowała w przypadku Konrada podróżującego po raz pierwszy na zachód, kiedy opuszczał Berdyczów, właściwie Żytomierz, te wschodnie tereny byłej Rzeczypospolitej, rozebranej Rzeczypospolitej i wyruszył w podróż do Marsylii. Wtedy mówił o tym, zresztą pan profesor w swojej książce wspomina, że czuł się jak we śnie. I tutaj pojawiło się we mnie takie pytanie, czy nie jest tak, że Konrad powinien tym zachodem, w którym wtedy powstawały te wielkie grand hotele w XIX wieku we Francji, wszystko wznosiło się na tej maszynie kapitalistycznej, czy nie powinien on się za tym zachodem zachłysnąć? Czy on nie powinien zakochać się w tego rodzaju, w tym modelu rozwoju? W końcu opuszczał ziemię, która była zwłaszcza po powstaniach zniszczona, bez perspektyw rozwoju gospodarczego. Wobec tego to było dla mnie frapujące. Dlaczego on się nie zakochał tak w tym modelu, tylko zaczął być jego krytykiem?
Yeah. He had been west earlier. He'd traveled with his tutor a couple of summers previous to this. So he had actually been to places like Venice and other areas outside of Poland. I think it's also it's interesting he went to Marseille, and he obviously went to Marseille because he wanted to be a sailor. But Marseille was quite a rough place in this period. That it's not the same as I was going to say it's not the same as the Grand Boulevards in Paris. But what had happened in Marseille was the Marseille that he mentions in The Arrow of Gold, that he draws attention to, is actually the way in which Marseille had its second empire, Marseille. There'd been a massive rebuilding of Marseille shortly before he arrived, so that the main streets and some of the central areas had been redesigned. But he's in a provincial place rather than being he's not in Paris, is probably partly the answer to that. He does describe it being like in a dream, but it's hard to say what aspect of it would be dreamlike, whether it was the wealth that he saw there, or whether it was he was leading quite a varied life there, dividing his time partly between a legitimate salon through his connections through Polish connections, and hanging out with the sailors around the old port, and also being part of some group of young artists as well. So he's mixing in various different communities while he was in Marseille. There's a very interesting account of that migration in a story called Amy Foster, which is about someone who is someone from the Carpathian Mountains who is wanting to emigrate to America and pays to go on a ship, and the ship sinks off the English coast, and then it's about his landing on the English coast. But what Conrad does in that is convey a sense of the strangeness of these places he goes to, the strangeness of the huge station that he passes through in Germany, the strangeness of this huge ship that he then embarks upon. So that it's a very interesting defamiliarized narration that takes place there, defamiliarized presentation of large stations of ocean-going ships before this man arrives on the coast.
So moje pytanie ma tło i jest pytanie właściwe. Tło jest brytyjski model modernizacji kapitalistycznej świata, był udanym w wielu aspektach, podczas gdy rosyjski, bo jest książka Malte Rolfa o panowaniu imperialnym w Królestwie Kongresowym Nadwiślańskim kraju z 16 roku po polsku, wydanie niemieckie w 15 roku. I jest ten temat postkolonialny dyskutowany w sensie relacji peryferium, niby Warszawa, centrum Petersburg i studiując jak się władze imperialne rosyjskie zachowały w naszym peryferyjnym, przywiślańskim kraju, on doszedł do pewnych wniosków. Teraz pytanie jest, to jest tło. Pytanie jest takie, Wielka Brytania miała swoje podbrzusze czułe, Wielka Brytania miała problem z Irlandią, tak jak Rosja miała z Polską w jakimś stopniu. I katolicka Irlandia była problemem dla Wielkiej Brytanii, którą pan rozumie. Być może Konrad wiedział o tym i pytanie jest, na ile narracja o Konradzie i myślenie literatury i akademii humanistycznych anglosaskich, świadomych tego, że niepodległość Irlandii działa się w czasie I wojny, podobnie jak Polski, i jakiś de Valera tam był, potem były związki Belgią, też jakiś tam król Belgów. No w każdym razie skomplikowana historia relacji i co tam Brytyjczycy mają na sumieniu z Irlandią, a co Rosjanie, no to możemy porównać. I pytanie jest wokół tego, jak się sytuuje w takim razie taka postać, która przyjeżdża do tego kraju nadtamizańskiego i w tym ten panowanie imperialne i peryferie i takie tam problemy postkolonialnej etyki, polityki czy estetyki. To jest to pytanie. Jak się tu Konrad mieści w pańskiej opinii?
He would certainly have been aware of Ireland. Because I'm thinking partly also that one of the other figures I'm thinking about here is his close friend Ford Madox Ford. And one of the links between them is that Ford too comes from that kind of complex background in that Ford's father was from Germany and a lot of Ford's family relations were in Germany. And that Ford had gone to a school where he spoke 3 languages, French and German as well as English. So he was trilingual, so that what things that Conrad and Ford had in common would have been complicated, would have been this bilingualism or multilingualism, and also these affinities with other cultures, and also the fact that they were both Catholic. There is a line or a presence of to do with Ireland in the story The Secret Agent, in that what's one of the things under the surface, although The Secret Agent is about a bombing campaign which is allegedly to do with anarchism, that what underlies that is actually an earlier bombing campaign in London, which is to do with Sinn Féin and with Irish freedom, with the Irish independence struggle. So that Conrad would certainly have been aware of that when he was writing The Secret Agent, that he would have been aware of that subtext present in the novel. He doesn't actually say very much about Ireland and the Irish situation that I can think of. So specifically the Irish side, I'm not sure that that's something that I know that he engages with. And it might have been because he felt it would be too awkward for his English hosts for him to raise this question. I think that rather than being a question of post-colonialism, I think what is present in his work is rather an anti-colonialism. I think it's present there in Heart of Darkness, in his critique of what is going on in the Congo. And that experience for him was a really very transformative experience and was an eye-opening experience for him. And it's present also, I think, in Nostromo. But I don't think he engages with the post-colonial as such. I think that's something I think he's too early to engage with the post-colonial.
Jeśli nie mają Państwo pytań, to ja pozwolę sobie zadać jeszcze swoje ostatnie dodatkowe pytanie do pana profesora. Zabawmy się w zupełną spekulację. Wyobraźmy sobie, że Joseph Conrad jest autorem, można powiedzieć, z jego mentalnością, z jego jakby konstrukcją psychologiczną, duchową, żyjącym współcześnie, przyglądającym się współczesnej globalizacji, powiedzmy, że zamiast pływającym na statku, pracującym jako spedytor w międzynarodowej korporacji. Jak pan myśli, oczywiście naprawdę tutaj bawiąc się w zupełną spekulację, nad jakimi wątkami współczesnej globalizacji, współczesnego świata Joseph Conrad mógłby się, czy chciałby się pochylić dzisiaj?
That was a question. I'm just thinking. I think the three things that come to mind are, I think he would be interested in what's happening in Africa. And obviously at the moment that would involve an engagement with the pandemic and with the responses to the pandemic. I think he'd be also interested in what's happening in Ukraine, on the Ukraine border. And I suspect also maybe the Belarus border as well. I've got a feeling that he would be interested in various things to do with borders. I'm trying to think where his economic interests would take him. I imagine he would also be quite interested in what's going on with things with social media and with the role of social media. Given his interest in the telegraph, railway systems, and all those infrastructural systems, and the role of infrastructural systems, I think he might well be very interested in the politics of those contemporary infrastructures to do with electronic media. What do you think?
Nie wiem,
A jak
zastanawiam
panu
się,
się
jakby to
wydaje?
było spotkać Josepha Conrada na Facebooku i móc mu zadać pytania o to, co myśli o aferach z przepływami prywatnych informacji i zbieraniem ich przez wielkie koncerny. Ale to jest, myślę, że już pytanie, na które nikt nie będzie w stanie nam odpowiedzieć. Szanowni Państwo, czas naszego wieczoru dobiega końca. Chciałbym serdecznie podziękować naszemu honorowemu gościowi, panu profesorowi Robertowi Hampsonowi. Dziękuję, panie profesorze. Chciałbym również podziękować Państwu zgromadzonym na sali, naszym widzom przed komputerami obserwującymi transmisję na żywo. Chciałbym jeszcze raz podziękować również organizatorom naszego spotkania, czyli Instytutowi de Republika, patronom medialnym, Instytutowi Literatury i kwartalnikowi literackiemu Wyspa. Życzę Państwu miłego wieczoru i zachęcam do śledzenia kolejnych wydarzeń organizowanych w ramach Joseph Conrad Fellowship. Dziękuję serdecznie za uwagę. Panie profesorze, życzę udanego wieczoru i mam nadzieję, że pozostaniemy w kontakcie. Wszystkiego dobrego.
Thank you very much. Thank you.